Thank you. Yeah, so we are going to talk about how event sourcing, CQRS, and event-driven architectures can help you within the MDR landscape. And indeed, the MDR is for Europe, but the FDA in America will have the same compliancy standards. We added a yin-yang picture because basically we are yin and yang, but also the topic is a bit yin and yang. You have this wide, nice event sourcing, event-driven architecture, CQRS. We all love that, right? And then you have the dark side of compliancy. So we try to combine those. Hopefully we will succeed. Yeah, let's introduce ourselves a tiny bit. It was already done, of course. I'm the former CTO of Dear Health, currently in between jobs. So if you have some openings, let me know. I decided to leave. I've been developing software for 24 years, worked as a freelancer for a long time, did the architecture of Tiki for a part, together with Reset sitting there. Work basically in all kinds of domains, financial, healthcare, even talent repository for Randstad, the how do you call it? The contractor company. I've been doing mostly JVM, but the last couple of years more Python and Node.js. The I did Axon for a long time. I'm a former colleague of Alerts of way back, like 20 years ago, when he just invented it. It was not at Axon, but it was at a company before that. And that's me, and then Alson.
Yeah, I'm Alson. I've worked with Job for about 4 or 5 years at Dear Health. I've had many roles. Right now, I'm the tech lead. I'm a staff engineer. I'm doing software architecture, data engineering, security officer. I know something also a bit more about the compliance side. And I've been in software. My original background was biophysics, and I was already doing some software-ish things there. I don't know if anyone ever used LabVIEW. It's not the nicest way of programming, but and I've been doing software for about 16 years with also some related fields.
So what's Dear Health? Let's quickly introduce it. It's a platform in which health providers can deliver healthcare to chronically ill patients. And chronically ill can be IBD, it can be heart failure, it can be cancer, because cancer is also a chronic disease. And what we do is risk-based care pathways. That means that the first thing Dear Health will ask the doctor is a couple of questions, and based on that, it calculates a risk for that patient. Is it a high-risk patient? Then it goes to a high-risk care pathway. If it's a low-risk patient, it goes to low. And with some inflammatory diseases, it also makes a difference between maintenance care pathways. Okay, it's going well, but let's keep it that way. Or the inflammation flaming up care pathways. We need an intervention now, so we have to do a stricter treatment. We deliver, or I'm no longer there, but we deliver a provider portal and a patient app. The provider portal gives the doctor insights in the patient, in the treatment plan, in these risk-based care pathways, but also the recommender. We will talk about that later. And the patient app is basically for telemonitoring, asking the patients questionnaires every 3 months or 2 weeks in advance of a consult or whatever, and doing health assessments, which are basically questionnaires. And he can see, of course, his treatment plan and also his appointments in it. Oh, you did it?
Just leave it.
Okay.
Just don't touch.
Don't touch. You are going to.
Yeah. So healthcare software is a difficult field because there's a very rigid compliance. We'll go a bit more into that, but there are several different directions, like data protection, the medical safety, quality management. There's requirements that are both like legal, like to sell a medical product, you need to meet certain requirements. And also because our customers are hospitals, the hospitals themselves will have requirements like, hey, if we're sending our patient data to you, we want you to meet these standards even if they're not legally required. And in the past, we've been active in the US, and it was even more fun because then the EU has these requirements and the US hospitals have requirements, and they're not the same. So that was even more fun. So this is definitely focused on the EU, at least from the regulatory point of view. And on the other side of the balance, of course, are the requirements. And doctors aren't the best people at describing what they want, I would say. So you can talk to doctors at length, and our customer success people do that, and then the conclusion is they need a solution for this problem, but 3 months later they'll have the problem will turn out to be different, and you have solved the problem that wasn't actually there. So we are constantly needing to make changes, but the other side, the regulatory side, makes it very difficult because they want things to be static. And the most important regulation we have is the medical device regulation, the MDR, that Job was already touching on. So the MDR, I'm not going to read all of this, but it's a regulation to control the quality of medical devices and the safety of medical devices sold in the EU. Dear Health, our product, is classified as a Class 2A device, which means as much as that we actually every year need to have external auditors check that we're doing everything right. And the origin of the MDR is regulating physical devices. Like some years ago, there was an issue with, for example, breast implants leaking, which of course shouldn't ever happen. And these are the kind of device was primarily aimed at. Like if you have a breast implant, you want it to be solid, it shouldn't leak, it shouldn't be dangerous to you, it shouldn't have a certain lifetime. And then at some point, which was in 2021, I think, they decided, yeah, let's also do this for software. And it can be a bit difficult because, for example, most of us engineers, probably if we talk about our production software, that means our software that's run in production as opposed to acceptance or some other place. But when MDR talks about production software, it's the software used to produce your product. So these kind of issues, and then we have some procedure that says for production software you should do this and this, and all the engineers are confused. And also there are requirements regarding like contamination, like incoming inspections and other things that are very hard to apply to software. And ideally the MDR wants you to, before every release, run a whole bunch of like both manual and automated tests, write a report. Depending on the size of your change, you should also send a report to your auditor first, and then finally release it to customers, which, as you might imagine, is kind of difficult with agile development and continuous delivery. So that's where the tightrope is coming in. Let's have a look at our architecture. So we have, can I point on this? So we have a patient which uses a patient app, and a practitioner or provider which uses the provider portal. And these all go to our backend. We have a patient API and a practitioner API. The backend consists of a whole bunch of microservices. They deliver events to our event bus and receive events from there. And then on the other side, there's also external connections from the hospital system, the electronic medical records, which also go through a microservice and up on the event bus. And then we'll talk about later in detail from the event bus, we go into data events, and eventually the recommender. But we'll talk about that later.
We don't use Axon, so if you want me to tell you Axon is great, it is, because I used it before. But in this case, we did it in Python. So we wrote our own CQRS framework. It's always handy to have github.com/Axon next to it when you do that. We also are in the serverless architecture, so fitting Axon in would have been really difficult at that point, Python and serverless. So we used a simple, much more simple, because it's not a framework, right? It's our own internal framework, CQRS framework that used DynamoDB for the event store. It uses SQS, Lambda, SNS, and Event Bridge for publishing events. And for the query models slash projections, we of course use almost all kinds of things. Elasticsearch for one case, Dynamo for another, Aurora DB for yet another one. Next. So basically how it all works, you have AppSync or API gateway, which are the two exposers, HTTP versus GraphQL. A command handler Lambda. Command handler Lambda will load the aggregate for a snapshot store and a event store. You recognize those from Axon probably. Execute the command and store the events back and publish the events on the event bus. So what we do a lot in here, what helps us is having, with all the changes, for example, the patient overview is really difficult because it's per disease, it requires different fields, but there's also this relationship: can a doctor treat these patients? Is it in the same department? Is the hospital system allowed? So we have, for example, a patient overview service that's purely a projection service, I would say, right? It doesn't accept comments, it just listens to all those events, builds an Elasticsearch model for it, and then we can serve out a patient overview for the doctors, that they can see their patients, can easily search it, use it for everything. And all the services, of course, fire those events in different formats, or in the same format, but from different services to the event bus, and they will listen. Most important thing always, but you all do that anyways, is everything is an event. So every treatment update, changing your care pathway, adding an activity, the doctor can plan an extra consult, right? You have the default care pathways of a patient, but he can also add an extra consult or remove a consult. Everything is an event. You find it with the event storming and event modeling ways. But also, and that there comes the mix with the MDR, patient interactions are always an event, and we store everything that he does as an event in the event store, so that we always have a trace, and we do this for doctors as well. But the data we pull in from the EMR, so when a patient is first loaded in, we pull in all the labs, for example, we all store them as events. And then there it gets tricky because the date of the event is today, of course, but the date of lab can be 20 years ago. So you have to take that into account. How are you going to work with that? Next, yeah.
Then there's also other things we use events for, like medical file access, which is not something the platform itself particularly cares about, but some standards like NEN 7513, which is one of those things that hospitals want us to meet. They say you should be logging all access, so that's why we generate events for that. Also, logging in and out kind of makes sense from an audit point of view. You want events for that. Sometimes we use them. And another thing we can do with the events is, since we have all the events and we can collect them all in a data lake, just event bus, throw them to Kinesis and dump them in S3. And that's something that we use for our dashboarding and BI.
Even failed logins are saved as an event, because for ISO 27001 and others, you need to do something with them.
And then the NEN 7513 says more. It doesn't just say you should log any access, but it also says you need to log, like, I think their IP address and what kind of login method they use, like SSO or something else. And we all send these as metadata as part of the events for the purpose of being able to use them for auditing. So for that we have an audit service which receives a whole lot of events that are relevant for them, and this is actually a bit complicated because of course NEN 7513 doesn't really map to what we're doing, because it talks about like opening a file like we're some sort of database or something. But we map all these we receive all these events that are relevant, and then we map them to the format that the NEN norm requires, because it's very strict about the type of format you'd have. And then we create a projection in our audit table that, when needed, which is once a year when the auditor asks for it, can generate a CSV with the data they want. Another thing we do with metadata is like many of the events don't really contain any personal identifiable information, but obviously something like a patient created that will contain the name and phone number of the patient, for example. And those events we mark in the metadata with a flag that says this event has PII, so we can very easily, for example, through an event bridge rule, filter out and say this area can't receive any PII, or no, at least these are the events we need to mask.
Yes. Yeah, everything is encrypted, mostly using AWS services, so KMS. They are encrypted in transit and they are encrypted at rest. But we don't do, we rely on AWS, they encrypt the database, we don't do specific encryption in the database. So if you have the key, you can still read. It's also what we prefer, because otherwise you look at the database if you ever have a problem and then you see only weird things in there. It makes debugging really hard. Yeah.
That means if you have to delete the data for a patient, you are basically throwing the key away and hope that this can never be cracked.
No, we throw away in the microservices, and that's where we're going in now. In the data stores it's different, but in the microservice we throw away everything, even the events. I know it's not really event sourcing if you delete the events, but we just wanted to be sure we really get rid of it. So basically in the Bootstrap service, if you generate a new service, there is already a listener for a patient deleted event, and you have to implement it. So every service, the patient service fires the patient deleted event if there is a GDPR request, or if the hospital no longer treats this patient with this, and then all the servers clean it. But it's hard in a distributed system to be sure, because if you forget to implement it, don't let others know. Data events. Deleting is for GDPR. You can also do it, of course, with encrypting, for example, all the events and then throwing away the encryption keys. There are multiple ways to achieve it. This was at that point the simplest, because encrypting all the events also comes with a performance penalty and a complexity. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, depending on the type of deletion, we also sometimes just mask the private data. Because also the MDR requires us to do post-market surveillance, which is basically checking how well is the product working in the market. And we also need to retain the non-PII data of the patients, like how did their health evolve, without having any personal identifiable characters. So we also mask part of the events.
Yeah, that's what I was going to talk about now.
You're welcome.
So, because there is a need for us to keep some data, but also there is the need to do AI studies, data science studies on the patient's events, and even if they left the application, we wanted to have events that we could keep, and that's where data events come in. Data events have PI masked. There is a coupling table, of course, between the original ID and the new ID in the data event. That coupling is deleted when the GDPR request is coming in, so you can't reason back to the original ID anymore. And data events only have the data in it that's relevant for the data studies, data services, but will have all normal data but no identifiable data. And they are flattened. Because in the beginning we had like 20 microservices. Well, it's not the beginning, but at a certain point we had 20 microservices. And then you want to do data studies, but you find that you have, for your projection to make a database of those events to do a study on, you have to listen to those 20 events, and then something changes in one of the events, you have to update it. It's not scalable at a certain point, because you keep updating all those services that listen to everything at the end. So we introduced the data event. It's a flat event which consists of key value pairs. And all events get mapped in the data event extractor, or normal events. So new lab results get mapped to a data event where the lab is just a key for ferritin, for example, and the value and some other data maybe. This allowed us to do a couple of things. One of the things in healthcare is often that per disease the doctor wants to see different fields on his patient screen. They don't want every time the same fields because, well, your heart rate might be really interesting for one doctor, but if you are treated for another disease, your heart rate is saying nothing. So we made an unstructured data service where we store those keys and values. So heart rate would be a key and then the value. And then the front ender had a generic form that he could say, give me a form with these keys, and it would ask the backend the keys. And we could configure, the product people could configure per disease which fields to show. Another often asked feature was having graphs of your heart rate. I mean, your current heart rate is not that interesting, but a graph of your rest heart rate over the last month might be interesting. You will see your blood spikes, your spikes when you have drunk too much. You can see all kinds of things. So we also had front-end components to make different kind of graphs, and you could just say, okay, plot these keys from the TimeStream database. TimeStream is an Amazon time series database, basically. And it would just graph it out. So if they needed a new graph, we would just say, yeah, that's a product people problem and not a us problem. That's always the best kind of problem. There's also derived values. BMI is one of the most simple ones, right? Everybody knows BMI. It's your, well, I don't know the formula. It has to do with your length and your weight. Mine is too high. That's all I know. But you can see it. You can see BMI is this formula, and what we now do is have a listener to data events. If the field weight is in there, or if the field length is in there, recalculate it and publish a new event with a new value of the BMI. This way we could easily add all kinds, because some diseases have specific formulas. I don't come to the name, but it were really complex formulas to calculate a certain score that the doctors in that disease knew what it would indicate.
Yeah, doctors really like scores for things, and that's some indication of how severe something is, and the score is then this value times this static constant divided by this one, and yeah, they really like their scores in their research.
And then last but not least is the event-driven recommender. It was our core business. What we did with Dear Health is that you can do this risk-based care pathways. That was already kind of unique. Well, it was kind of simple, but what really was our main selling point was having a recommender in it that would react to events, and events being, okay, there's a new lab result, or the patient filled in a new questionnaire. So this recommender has to respond to all those events, but it's much easier when you just respond to a change in a key value than having to listen to all those different events. Alson is going to talk a lot more about the recommender, but what it would do is have that event, look into it, execute some rules, and see if there is a recommendation for the doctor. Well, the benefits are, I think, already clear, but the main benefit being that when you have a new event in your system, and you often have new events when you build new features, you don't have to go in all the deep data services, but you can change it in one place and add a new mapping for the data event extractor. Even if you are if you have made a mistake in that, you can replay all the original events through the data event extractor, generating new ones. And yeah, it makes life easier for the other service teams to create services that respond to your data instead of having to know your whole event catalog.
Yeah, so about the event-driven recommender, it listens to data events because it makes the life for the recommender much easier than having to know every single event structure, and the data event structure is really simple, the key value pairs. It has a domain-specific language by which a medical engineer, or ideally eventually medical people like a doctor, can configure the rules per disease. And this has two goals. I mean, A, as software engineers, we don't really want to be bothered by those. But also, especially if we can make the customer do it, it moves the responsibility away from us, which from like a compliance point of view would be an advantage, because the recommender is kind of the most sensitive thing regarding compliance, because it actually says to the doctor, hey, consider giving this patient this and this treatment, which is considered high risk. And also, the goal of the recommender is matching the rules to the data and potentially historical data, and then generating or not generating a recommendation based on that. And the recommendations can go multiple ways, like within the provider portal, the doctor, they can see the recommendations. Sometimes they're more aimed at the nurses. There's a recommendation for the nurse to do something, especially if we're using the recommender to kind of facilitate following a protocol, where there's a protocol in the hospital. If this happens, you should give this medicine, and the recommender can at that point say like, hey, this has happened, so now you should give this medicine. And the recommendations can be shown either in our own provider portal or in some external system. Like sometimes we have other systems that we connect to, so we get data from the external system, converted into data events, and the recommendations go back into the external system. I'm not sure if you can read it, but I'll briefly take you through the flow. The data event comes in, and in the recommender, then the recommender, based on the disease of the patient, will load the rules for that patient. If there's no rules, then there's nothing to do. Then it will load the historical data, because it also keeps track of the historical data for each patient, because of course often in medicine it's not relevant, like you were saying, what's your heart rate right now, but maybe how does it compare to last month's average heart rate. Then based on the historical data and the input, it will evaluate the rules. And if there's a recommendation, then it will publish the recommendation on the event bus. So the recommender uses a domain-specific language. Here you can see some examples. They are basically if-then statements. The when above says what type of event it's expecting, and then it has an event object that has all the fields of the data event, which are simple key values, so we can easily query it like this. And also, if you look at the bottom example with historical data, we have a patient object in there, which has the historical data, which you can query in kind of a pandas-like syntax. Like I want the body weight between 6 and 1 month ago, for example.
Yeah, we are going a bit fast, I think. But
yeah. We ask the doctor to accept or reject a recommendation, so that's indeed a built-in mechanism which the medical engineers can evaluate, like, hey, this recommendation is often rejected, maybe there's a problem with it.
But the doctors come up with the rules. We don't come up with the rules. It's together with the doctors that we come up with the rules. In general, due to the MDR, they also have to be scientifically based. So we were working on some sort of smart notification that it wouldn't be a recommendation, because then you could do a little bit more for some doctors. Some doctors wanted to know, get an alert when a value was something, but there was no science proving that. It was their own method, right? And the MDR doesn't allow you to put that in, but he could get a smart notification on the system, but we didn't finish that yet. But then there would be a difference in how you treat it. And of course, we stored recommendations rejected and recommendations accepted events and could analyze that. But seeing the doctors in general came up with the rules, they didn't reject them much because. It's all in our own event store, and we can get them in the data services and analyze it. Yeah, we often used Athena in AWS to do. We made a CSV file out of the events and did analysis on it. But unfortunately, the patient count was not that high, so it was always a bit hard. Any more questions? I continue. Key takeaways for regulated systems. The most important one is the third one, I think. We found out later. We registered Dear Health as a class 2A within the MDR. The whole system, because we did the recommendations, was in a high class. If you use microservices, it's perfectly possible to say, okay, no, I register the big part of my system as a lower class risk that you can do self-assessments instead of having an audit every year, and only make the parts of the system that require a higher class a separate service. So then your development teams can do have much more freedom in the simple services, and the recommender becomes the hard part. So keep that in mind if you make something in the MDR. Try to isolate as much as possible what falls under the MDR. It makes your life much easier. Privacy by design, of course, with patient data. I mean, in the Netherlands, we just had this big hack of a lab system that data of all women that did breast cancer research were on the streets, were on the black market. So you basically go bankrupt when your database gets out there, right? So make sure that you do everything with privacy and security in mind. Event sourcing enables double goals. Of course, it helps you build your system your way, and you can. I think we had 2 or 3 versions of the patient overview. It's easy to create a new one if it just replay the events and you have a new one. First we had it in RDS and then we had it in Elasticsearch. That's of course the goals you already know, but it also really helps with its auditing requirements. And then, compliance requires architectural compromises. I hope you can see that you can still do a lot. But there are hard things. One of the most annoying things we had is they really want you to have a version number. We have 30 microservices. How do you calculate a version about it? That kind of things. The MDR is also new for the auditors, so they often are not home in software. That also made it hard. Things you already mentioned. Production means producing the device and not production. So that's basically it. Time for questions because we have 5 minutes left. No questions. Oh, one question. Yeah, I'm on an Axon conference, so I will be a bit careful in my wording. Yeah, of course, it makes life easier if you have it, but in the end, it worked quite well. Writing the CQRS framework, because you don't need the Axon guys need to generate a framework that works for all of you guys, right? You need to support all kinds of databases. We knew Dynamo was it. We knew SQS was the way to do messaging. So in that sense, it was rather simple. I also did the architecture kind of the same at Tiki before, so for me it was just improving the way I worked over there. Uh, so yeah, I didn't miss it much, but don't tell that to your boss.
There were some times I think where we had a problem and you were like, "Oh, Axon solved it this way,
Yeah,
so we can consider that."
and we are always following the blog of Alson saying aggregates can go, for example, and then we thought, oh yeah, maybe we can also do that.
Can you explain again when you move from event sourcing with data events? That part of
Unclear? Yeah. So basically, event sourcing is still in the main backend. So all the microservices use event sourcing. They get published on the event bridge. There is a listener on the event bus. That's called the data event extractor, and that one translates them to data events. And then you can listen to or data events or normal events or both. We did it in a couple of places, but it gets confusing.
But the normal events are a single source of truth. The data events are just derived.
yeah, and so this data event extractor does the migration regarding microservices, which reduce the regulatory impact because you can just have events also as the data.
No, yeah, but the data events are used in the recommender, and that's the highly restricted. So the data events don't help with compliance, getting rid of compliancy afterwards.
Every microservice that is the data service events or the data events, but it extracts from it when it needs them. You'll still get the sensitive data.
Yeah,
It's still sensitive. Yeah, in the data events there is no personal identifiable information, but it's still sensitive. And you could argue that we had to put age in there because it's a relevant number, right? We restricted it to year. But, but data studies on medicine, actually you would even need race and gender, and where we didn't do that yet. But it's medical relevant, so. Data studies making them completely unidentifiable is hard.
You can still get this separate, like regulation from separate services, even though they get the same data from.
Yeah, because you basically say, okay, I have the event recommender, it listens to data events, it's just the contract, and that's but the data events can come from our system, but they could as well come from a different system in that sense. But that's also the MDR pulls everything in. It's a greedy bastard. If you have an event-driven recommender, class 2A, and we got bought and they wanted to integrate a general practitioner system with this, but as soon as they use our recommender alone, they would also need to be MDR certified. And maybe not class 2A, but they still need a level of certification. And that also applied for our other services, because we trusted them to work with the event-driven recommender. They still need a certification, but it can be a less high. And it saves a lot if you are in class 1, because then you do self-assessments. You don't have external auditors coming every year for a week. It's not fun to be in an audit for a week, I can tell you.
Did you also notice any limitations with this approach?
Well, we were not there yet, so I can't tell you. We were working on isolating the event-driven recommender as a separate medical device, but I left in September. We were not at the stage yet, so I can't. In a year, maybe Alson can tell you. Ah, yeah, of course you can also, like everything, if you forget to make a mapping, it doesn't work. You have to have a key mechanism that works, right? So how do you make sure that the key, because you can say, okay, it's the name of the lab, but the lab can also be measured in different unities. So to be able to plot it out in a graph, it should all be in the same unit. So the unit should also be in the key. So there's a lot of challenges that choosing the keys correctly and mapping the data to the correct key. Well, the data events not because they are simply key value. The normal events, yes, we did, but not a lot because I always try to, if you change an event, add something to it and give it a default value and use an upcaster kind of a mechanism. But sometimes it's limiting, right? Because in the beginning you think about the system in a certain way and it evolves, and then you are like, okay, but that's not the correct way to name it.
And we've had to move event to a different aggregate also,
Yeah.
because we redid the aggregate boundaries.
Kind of, and sometimes twice we did a migration of events, I think. Yeah. Yeah, our fault.